So let's get straight into our toolbox talk for this morning on emergency management. Now, emergency management obviously is something that every single one of us out there in the industry needs to plan or prepare for. And as plumbers, there are certain emergency situations that you will notice have come up perhaps in the past. A few toolbox talks have discussed this in the past as well. And we'll go through in the future also discussing each one of these emergency situations in more detail. But an emergency, or the definition of an emergency, is an undesired event that has caused or has the potential to cause personal injury or death, damage to property or the environment. Now, an emergency plan or planning for an emergency is a comprehensive plan to, first of all, try and prevent this emergency situation, avoid the situation if you can, manage the situation once you are in it, and then also recover from an emergency situation. So it's very important for us to know and understand that an emergency plan is not just about what to do in an emergency, it's what to do to try and prevent this emergency from actually affecting us as a company or even our employees, as well as the recovery stage from when an emergency has affected us. So yes, just as important as the actual management during an emergency is the pre and post emergency plans. Now, emergency plan must be specific. It must be specific to your scope of work, to the site that you're working in, as well as the environment around you. Now, why do we say that? You might say to yourself, but the emergency is the same no matter what I'm doing. As a plumber, we have identified the emergencies. And so we can clearly see that these emergencies are going to affect us no matter where we are. And that is true. Perhaps you've looked at all of your scope of works as a plumber and you've ensured that all emergency situations that could occur have been identified. However, the site always changes. And so maybe the step-by-step procedure on evacuation, fire, who to call in an emergency situation is going to be different, because you might be working in Benoni the one day, and then you're going to be moving to Pretoria the next. Well, you're going to have two different fire departments to call on. Perhaps you're in Durbanville down in the Cape Town area, and then you're moving and you need to go and work all the way out in Somerset West. Well, you're not going to be able to call the SAP from Milnerton. You will have to look for a local police station. So this is the reason why it needs to be site specific. Also, the types of emergencies on a site could also differ. For instance, if you had a chemical spill at a private home, working inside of a roof ceiling, and you spill the chemical, underneath that ceiling, you're probably going to have the client's home and their belongings. If nobody is at home, well, a few of their belongings are going to get damaged, and you're going to have to use your insurance to cover that. However, if you are on a different site, perhaps working near a dam or a river or a stream, and now you are changing waste piping, and there you have a hazardous chemical spill, now you could be polluting the ground or water. And this is a far bigger impact on a chemical spill. So you can see why it's so important not just to have the identified emergency, but the specific plan for the specific site or environment that you are in. And they will always differ. None of us are going to have an impact on an environment if we're working on a concrete floor where there's not much space to really spill for the ground or air or water pollution. However, working inside waste areas, working near dams, reservoirs, water sources, things like that, well, there the risk for this emergency to impact the environment is a lot greater. And so we need to consider this all the time. So let's look at the types of emergencies that you as a plumber might face. One of the big ones is obviously COVID-19. This is an emergency situation. And you might think to yourself, why do we actually consider this an emergency situation? Well, let's look at it this way. We just recently had a client, and I won't mention their name. They have 10 staff. 8 of them were found positive for COVID-19. Now, what do you think would happen to a company like that where 80% of their staff had COVID-19? Well, they all were sent home. They are now on 2 weeks, obviously isolation. The job, though, is an on-site job. It's a physical job that needs to be done. They cannot work from home. And so the risk assessment we performed is that it is extremely high for their company if one of their members or employees gets COVID-19. So you can see the massive impact. And obviously, the owner of the company is worried a lot about the financial impact that this will have on the company, having 80% of his staff not being able to work on a site. So we can really see this would be an emergency situation. 8 people have the potential of dying due to the COVID-19 virus. Yes, the percentages show that not many people have died according to how many get sick. But the potential with the third wave is even greater. And so the emergency plan had to change. And so we needed to relook at it, redesign it, remanage this type of emergency. Then we look at things like falling. As plumbers, you are always working at heights, whether it's doing an installation or maintenance, or perhaps even going up just to do an inspection. You're using ladders, scaffolding. Sometimes you have to climb up caged or cat ladders. Some of you are using mobile elevated working platforms like a cherry picker or a scissors lift. And the great risk there, or the hazard of working at heights, would involve the risk of falling. And this would be a type of emergency. A person who falls is going to get injured, whether in a harness or whether they fall to a lower level and actually contact the ground. Then we think of things like fire, persons who are working with hot works, welding, grinding. These all cause a hot work environment, and the potential for fire and fire damage then also has a fire emergency. Personal injuries, evacuations, storms, the contamination of ground because of hazardous chemical substances, or the spillage and injury from hazardous chemical substances. What about the emergencies in the use of power tools, such as electrocution, the use of machinery, getting caught between or crushed due to some of the machinery that we use? What about unknown things like a bomb scare? You think to yourself, well, why would we prepare for this? Well, it is something that does occur. And it might be very small or very concise, what your step-by-step procedure is for a bomb scare compared to what you would do in case of a fire. But it is an undesired event that has the potential to cause injury. What about armed robbery in the country that we live in? Civil unrest that seems pretty likely in the time that we're living in. So we can really see these types of emergencies have a potential impact on our business and the work around us. But each one of them have a varying degree of possibility. COVID-19 currently is a very high potential. If you're working at heights almost every week, well, falling would be a very high potential. If you're only working at heights perhaps once a month, well, then you can see that's a lot lower than what COVID would be, or perhaps what fire would be, because you're doing a lot more soldering, a lot more grinding, a lot more welding. So although we have generic templates to help you with types of emergencies and emergency planning, you can see it needs to still be tailor-made and to be specific to the type of work that you do, the amount of work that you do, the environment, as well as the site that you are on. Now, this is just a few examples of types of emergencies. There are a lot more out there, dependent on the scope of work, the work area, the tools, equipment that you're working with. Obviously, this can become a lot larger of a list. But what do you actually need to do with this list of information? Well, a full emergency plan must consist of the following. The first thing you really want to do is identify all the potential emergency situations you may face. Now, we are going to look at things like force majeure. These are things like storms, natural disasters. However, you're not going to really be preparing so much for a hurricane in Joburg as you would for flooding down, let's say, in KZN area. Now, in KZN area, there's a few places that do get flooded during the year. In Joburg, not so much. In Cape Town, you have the huge possibility of massive storms, especially if you are at the Cape of Storms, where a storm could arise within a few minutes. Now, Joburg does have storms, but we can pretty much see them coming. Unlike being in that Cape Town area, where within a few minutes, all of a sudden you see a storm coming out and you cannot really prepare for it. But it is a type of foreseen occurrence because we know that it has a habit of doing that, which means we can prepare for it. So when we identify potential emergency situations, be honest with the environment and area that you are working in, the type of tools and equipment you're working in, or even the area and environment that you have been placed in. Then the second thing that you need is a clear and concise procedure to try and prevent, if possible. Now, you cannot prevent a storm, can you? But what you can do is try and avoid that storm by being indoors. While you are in that storm, you can manage what happens during the storm. Things like closing windows and doors and barricading up to ensure the storm does not affect people. Then you go as far as to see how damage, and then even further to see what you can do in assisting the environment around you. Then you want to recover from that storm should have had an impact on you. Recovery from people, recovery from possessions, and so forth. Whereas a fire, there is the possibility to prevent it. And if there is the possibility to prevent it, what is the procedure to prevent it? Again, it will be different for every aspect. Whether it be welding and grinding inside of a thatch roof, which shouldn't be done, obviously you're going to see there the prevention would be almost elimination, substitution with a different type of fitting within plumbing that you can use in order to prevent or avoid totally the use of hot works within that environment. Chemical spills. Can you prevent a chemical spill from occurring? Well, there's a lot of procedures for the use, handling, and storage of hazardous chemical substances before we get to the emergency prevention of that. So the entire procedure must be specific for each emergency situation. We're not going to clump them all together. We want to have a detailed step-by-step procedure of what to do for a fire, what to do for a emergency evacuation. Again, this might be 3 different procedures for a fire within a building, for a fire outside in a veld, for a fire on top of a roof. Again, this comes down to how you are planning your work and where you are working in your environment. So you can see health and safety is not just a once-off, is it? It's not just a one file that we design and there we go. We finished with that file. We print out a whole lot of them for every site that we go to. We need to manage the types of works and types of emergency situations we will face. Then you will need resources, both physical and administrative resources. And I've made 2 extra slides at the end of this where we're going to discuss in more detail just the 2 types of resources that you might need. And we cannot go into too much detail, but this is just a baseline of what you should be requiring in terms of an emergency. And then continual training on the emergency plan. All staff, according to Section 13 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, it's the duty of the employer to inform his staff on anything that is in the interest of occupational health and safety. This would include things like COVID-19, where we've assisted you in designing the free COVID awareness course. So we've taken the act, the regulations, and we've compiled it into 4 videos in order to make employees aware of their responsibility. Now, we are trying to work on more types of training like this, where you can use this training in order to explain to your staff what to do in an emergency situation. But it's very simple. Take the clear and concise procedure that you have designed and read through it with your staff. But please try and do this in a manner that encourages the staff to also be involved in the training procedure. Now, the reason for this is sometimes we get to sites and we've asked them, have you trained your staff on a risk assessment or induction? They say yes. We ask them for the file. They disappear for 5 minutes. They come back and an attendance register is all of a sudden signed with different dates on it. Now, we know what happened there, right? Nobody read the document. it was just taken from one employee to the next. It was quickly signed, and then it was given back into the safety file. Now, although that is a tick box procedure where we could tick off that the training was done, we needed to do a lot more than that as compliance officers. We went back in and started interviewing the staff. And that's how we came up with the information that they weren't actually trained. So please remember that a signature on a document does not necessarily mean that that person knows and understands the information. A lot more must be done from the employer side to ensure the employees are competent. Now, a competency is somebody that has skills, training, knowledge, even sometimes the qualification in a specific thing. So why not design internal training management systems for yourself? It doesn't have to be a long, lengthy thing. It must just be continual, and it must be specific to the work that they are performing. But get the employees involved so that when they are interviewed, they can say with certainty and with a lot of conviction that your company has trained them in what they are performing. And one of the issues and areas where they need training is in emergency planning. Then the last thing that must be done is a management review of the emergency plan. And this is where you are going to check whether it is effective in mitigating, avoiding, preventing, managing, and recovering from these emergency situations. So if you have had an emergency and you've recovered from it, management must sit down and see what was the procedure that was followed, and could something have been done differently or perhaps additionally in order to ensure the effectiveness of the control measures that are in place. Now, employees, you might think up to this stage, everything that we've spoken about is all put to the employer and the management. They must ensure management. Even the plan is called a management plan. And yes, this is true. Without management backing, any system will fail. But employees have such a huge responsibility as well as a massive part to play in emergency planning. And this is because you can bring out to us as managers and owners of businesses what types of emergencies you may face, potentials that you might see, and get yourself involved. You see, at the end of the day, the person performing the work, the employee, is the one who is likely to be in the emergency and be affected by that emergency. So please don't keep up, express yourself, do it in a manner that shows conformity, that also shows that you want to do it. Remember, there may be an additional responsibility on you should you want to be involved. Perhaps you will be appointed as a firefighter and sent for training, as a first aider and sent for training, which means you will now have responsibilities to uphold in an emergency situation. So if you want to be involved to protect lives around you, then why not get involved? And if you don't want to get involved, well, consider the fact or the reasons why not, and then chat to your management. See if there's something that's holding you back, that perhaps a little bit of training, a little bit more management, or a little bit more supervision can assist you with. So let's take a look at then the two types of resources you may need in an emergency situation. Now, obviously, as plumbers, we speak about this a lot of hot works. You will definitely need some sort of firefighting equipment. Now, on top of that, you need somebody who knows how to use the firefighting equipment, which means you have to have training. Then you have a first aid box. Now, according to your general safety regulations, Section 3, in particular, Section 3.2, it states that every company that has 5 employees must have a first aid box. Section 3.4 says if you have 10 employees, you must have a trained first aider. So where does this come from? Well, it's legislated because an employer, according to Section 8 of the OSH Act, must ensure a safe working environment for his staff. And in order to do that, he must look at specific regulations that impact that act, that support the OSH Act. the general safety regulations is one of those. So if you have 5 employees, you must have a first aid box, and it must be a box that is specific to your work. Remember, there are different regulations. There are 2 different regulation first aid boxes. Do you know which one you need? And do you have it? And if you have to have a trained first aider, have you been trained in first aid? Then what about spill kits? If you are using hazardous chemical substances, the potential for spilling these hazardous chemical substances is a possibility. What type of spill kit do you have in order to collect that hazardous chemical substance, dispose safely of that hazardous chemical substance, and then recover either yourself from exposure or the environment that you've exposed it to? Communication devices such as two-way radios or any communication device that may assist your emergency evacuation team, emergency controller, in ensuring each responsible person knows what they are supposed to be doing. And then physical signage. How do I get out of my building? By following the emergency evacuation sign. Where are my firefighting equipment located? Well, there will be a sign identifying this. Where do we gather in an emergency evacuation? Well, there will be a sign to show me where my emergency assembly point is. All of these things show a first aid box. There should be a sign. In an emergency, all of the identified items, you should have a specific sign or a specific document where it comes to administrative that you should know where it is and how to find these. So that leads us to the administrative side. You must have documented procedures. So this can be digital documents or paper-based documents of each emergency, and this would include your step-by-step guide for responsible persons and employees to follow. A firefighter must do this while employees evacuate to an emergency assembly point. Very specific, but very concise. Be very simplistic in your explanation of what needs to be done. Then you need to have appointments, documented appointments of the emergency team. Who is the emergency coordinator? Who's going to coordinate the evacuation? Who's going to be the fire marshal or firefighters, the first aider, the hazardous chemical substance controller, etc. And then the emergency contact numbers of your local services, the bomb squad, the fire department, the SAP, hospitals, spill units, poison units. All of this information needs to be documented and kept in that plan. Again, it must be not only specific to the scope of work, but the area in which you work as well. So again, this is all just very basic, very simple. We cannot go into more detail. There's a lot more information that is involved in emergency evacuation, emergency controlling, or emergency management as a whole. So if you need more information, please contact us. We really are there to assist you. Now, for those of you who have been affected by this third wave, we truly hope that you and your families are keeping safe. So in an interest of trying to assist as many as possible, this COVID-19 compliance officers course that is brought to you by OHSS Consulting and IOPSA, please remember it is free to all IOPSA members. If you want the awareness course for all staff, you're welcome to get that as well. And then the compliance officer course, the 4-module course that has been designed to take you through the understanding of what needs to be done as a compliance officer. Reach out to us on 071-875-2070. You can send us a WhatsApp there or an email to chris@ohss.co.za. Alternatively, there are some other email addresses you can send it to. That's the 2 on the top of the screen, safety@iopsa.org or info@ohss.co.za. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate that.